technical. I'm gonna turn off for now my video because my internet is not so stable. I mean, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, happy Friday, everyone. And we didn't see each other a long time. And for me, it's a really true pleasure to introduce Brandon LaBelle, an artist, writer, theorist, a friend, colleague, mentor for me, based in Berlin, and whose work, not only me, I believe, has been deeply influential in both artists, sound artists, theorists, and cultural workers. Brandon's practice focuses on agency, community, and pirate culture, with a strong emphasis on the poetics of sound and its ability to shape social spaces. He has numerous of projects, some to name, the Listening Biennial, which is still continuing. I'm sure Brandon gonna mention it. Communities and Movements, and the Imaginary Public, which challenge the conventional forms of community making and artistic practice. His independent publishing project, Errant Bodies Press, if you don't know it, I really recommend it to get some books and read it. Me personally, I got to know Brandon with the background noise perspective on sound art when I first started my PhD project. And which helped me a lot on, you know, navigating what is sound and relation to art, and especially like, you know, installations, sound installations, and so on. Later, of course, I got to know more about the publication Sonic Agency. Has had a particular impact on my own development as a young sound artist and academician. It speaks to how sound can be an active agent for social change, a theme that resonates with me a lot, with my artistic practice a lot. And I think that we touched a lot we talk a lot during the residency in the PRAKSIS last June, where sound became an essential part of our exploration. We all are my artist fellows. We all see the sound as a binding element, besides other elements, of course, of partying, and capable of creating communal experiences, which is also key when we think about the role of sound in partying. Brandon's work exemplifies how we can use sound in dynamic ways to activate the public spaces, build communities, and foster alternative modes of engagement. And before it goes too long, please join me in welcoming Brandon LaBelle. Thank you, Brandon.
Thank you. Thank you, Banu. Yeah, really nice to be here. Thank you for the very warm introduction and invitation to step into this wonderful forum. It sounds really exciting, the whole initiative, and I'm sure you had some wonderful conversations and exchanges, I would imagine. So it's lovely to join you, especially because, yeah, in recent, sort of over the last few years, parties have also become a form of concern in my own research, in my own work. And I'm going to kind of share with you some of that story. But maybe some of you are familiar with the Party Studies book series that we launched a couple of years ago. I've been collaborating with a group of friends in Madrid, and together we unpacked this project, Party Studies. Originally, we had planned that it would be a much more kind of socially, materially engaged project. We had planned basically a series of parties as workshops in Madrid, where we would come together in different configurations and embody the party in an explorative research way. But because of the pandemic, all of that got put on the shelf, and it resulted in books instead. So I have these, yeah, we have the Party Studies book, volume 1, and we just released Party Studies volume 2, which is the first volume was on the home and domestic space as an environment in which parties become really vital. In the second volume now, we focus on the underground, thinking about underground clubs, but also a kind of underground imagination and how that informs what we understand as parties. And we're currently starting the third volume, which is going to be on the topic of radical pleasure, which will take us more into a somatic perspective as well. So, so it's an ongoing project. And I wanted today to just maybe share with you some reflections, some theoretical positions and points that have been key to elaborating the project Party Studies. To sort of in a way ask ourselves, well, what do parties teach us? How do they impact on our understandings of ourselves, our communities, the possibilities of shaping the future? So I thought I would just take you through these perspectives. And then I wanted to share with you a project that kind of came out of the Party Studies initiative, which takes us closer into the ways in which parties might influence pedagogical or knowledge practices. So thank you again for having me. I do have a couple kids upstairs who like to jump around, so I hear that they're very active at the moment, so you might hear a party going on behind here. Let's see. One arrives, moves into the scene, which is brimming with energy. There are the matters thrown here and there, others arranged according to an intuitive idea. The passing of bottles and other stuff, a passing from the kitchen to the living room, to the balcony and back, to the bathroom and bedrooms. A general flow of festivity, being jostled here and there as the music, where there is always music, thumps and pumps, vibrating the scene, the skin, the neighbors. One arrives, enters this lively dance of commotion, the ebb and flow of laughter and longing, inebriation and hallucination, with the lights turned low, the walls splashed with shadows. It is hot. Someone opens a window, the clothes are peeled away, shoes come off as the music kicks up a notch to get us moving. Within this strange collaborative situation, things are pushed together, messed up. The life force of bodily being is given room. Time for joyous as well as painful revelations. So I want to map the party then as a complex social scene, which can contribute to manifesting forms of community, or I might already say to unraveling forms of community as well. So there are a number of perspectives we might put forward as a way of getting into the scene of the party, including questions of the body, thinking about what happens to the body in the midst of the party. Questions of sociality. Is the party proposing a type of social form? And finally, questions of knowledge. To think the party as an act of knowledge making, I would even say learning. So I'm going to kind of follow these three areas to unpack and maybe lead us to the idea of party studies. The party as both something to study, as well as a form of study in itself. That is, partying as an act of doing that is equally a kind of experiment in being. So to think the party right away as a kind of organizational endeavor, the making of a world. And I follow this through the work of Dimitris Papadopoulos and his notion of ontological organizing, to create the conditions for a particular form of life, a common world, one in this case of parties, one that is both hospitable and inhospitable, welcoming and also territorial, that is always close to formlessness. The party is on one hand socially acceptable. If we think of rituals of transition from birthdays to weddings, parties mark the occasion. And yet parties also act as scenes of rupture, excess. They also undo the social order. It, in a way, oversteps. The party then moves us toward a point of exhaustion, a going too far. From the expression of non-normative behavior, or what we might call nocturnal identities, to the reshaping of a given time and space, the making of a milieu, the party emerges as an aesthetic, social, ontological scene of invention, one that carries us somewhere else. The party, in a way, is a scene of wreckage. To party is to work at wreckage. So to start, we may think of the body then in the scene of the party as a wrecked body, a body gone too far. And in going too far, one somehow confuses the lines between life and death, between health, maintaining the body, a caring position, and illness, a suffering. These positions become rather unfixed and confused. The wrecked body commits itself to a certain type of suffering, to make oneself ill, which at the same time is an expression of celebration, a type of healing. One, in a way, recovers by way of self-destruction. We might think of this not so much as a form of becoming, a flourishing, rather it might be putting the body on hold. The wrecked body is not simply an expression of catharsis, an overcoming, though this may appear. Rather, it is an indulgence, a scene of delirium, which is both joyous and violent at the same time. The body takes on a rather trans-subjective or even anti-subjective positionality. The party body is a body continually displaced. It works against itself, drawing together passion and dejection, joy and self-destruction. And furthermore, it brings together a relation to intimacy as well as loss of control, putting these into a deeply unstable construct. This is what we could think of as the logic of the party, holding together contradictory or conflictual things. Where the body ends up is never so certain, but clearly it is close to oblivion. The party, after all, is often the very thing enabling escape from oneself, and importantly, the imperative of self-management. Here, I follow the work of Catherine Clement and her philosophy of delirium, which she articulates through an elaboration of the musical concept syncope, where a note lags behind and anticipates the rest of the movement. Syncope is highlighted as what creates delay. It staggers time, introduces gaps, hesitation, this lagging behind what we could think of as dropping the beat, only to recover it afterwards. This syncopation, yes, this movement of hesitation. Clement applies this to understandings of subjectivity and, importantly, processes or moments of transition. She writes, "The difficulty of crossing from one body to the next, from one stage to the next, and from life to death will always be a test. Initiations, love at first sight, depression, how to resolve these. Syncope is a coming out of oneself, a pause, or what she calls an eclipse of individuality. Staggering temporality, the order of the beat, and the forward progression of a productive self. Rather, the eclipse of individuality, this staggering, puts one on hold. Yes. It is rather becoming unproductive or being useless. In this sense, we might think of these interruptions, these syncopations, as a kind of force that operates as a vehicle for reinventing precisely the logic of a given order. To lag behind might be also to reinvent the very logic of the structure that keeps one in time. From such a view, the party body could be said to recover something of the body, an inherent bodily power, that which is often occluded by the obligation of control and self-management, the productive self. The wreckage of the party body is at the same time a type of healing, a gesture or an act that attempts to recover something of the body, that places the body at the edge of itself so as to not only disorient, but to reinvent itself as a pure vitality. So these are some first thoughts around questions of embodiment in a way that, I mean, we can unpack these together further, but what happens in a way when we step in and enter, what happens to the body in that scene of the party. So I want to continue a little bit now by moving to questions of community. What is the party's relation to the formation of community? Does the party have some sort of impact onto how we conceptualize communities? As the party is dramatically a social scene, how might we understand sociality, collectivity, and community by way of partying? Does something change or emerge? Within the delirious commingling the party creates, as a general state, we might think of as revolt. What becomes of the relational and feelings for being in common? Here, I'm going to follow a little bit the writings of Jean-Luc Nancy, which maybe some of you are also interested in, particularly his notion of the inoperative community. So in his wonderful book, The Inoperative Community, Nancy outlines ideas of community in contrast to what he calls communion. Yeah, so he's setting up this polarity or this tension between community and communion. So for Nancy, community is to be understood as the sharing of singularities, the sharing of singularities expressed as a state of passion, not so much defined by a notion of the project. So he's kind of cutting against the notion of the project being understood as a work of identification, a myth of lost origins that often the idea of the community kind of deploys, right? So he's sort of cutting against that to sort of suggest that we step away from the notion of community as a project. Rather, one is in a sense figured by way of what he calls a social ontology. Subjectivity as always already interrupted by the other. So his social model of sociontology understands that community is prior to individuality rather than the other way around. We tend to think, of course, to move from the self towards community. But Nancy suggests otherwise, saying that we start from community and through that discover ourselves as individuals. And in that sense, he's interested to think that we are always interrupted, yes, as selves, as singularities, as individuals. So this interruption that is community, that is in a sense the nature of community, is one that also unworks us as individuals, yes, staggers us, interrupts, leading less to an expression of communion. So communion for Nancy is always the sense of having to relate oneself to a single figure or a narrative of completion or even an idea of the one. The communion, in a sense, calls us into relating or into aligning ourselves with that singularity, with what we could think of as the truth. Rather, community is that which interrupts, always positioning us as a social subject, a social ontology. So community is therefore defined by what he thinks of as a transcendent quality, which is to say that we are always, in a sense, shaped by something external, rather than think of the idea of communion as that which holds itself together through a form of immanence, to feel or to identify or to construct identities through a sense of alignment with singularity, with a figure in the center, which we can think, of course, constructs of nationalism that often deploy community and call us into a project of identification with a national narrative, for example. So Nancy's social ontology and what he ultimately calls the inoperative community, the community that in a way unworks us, that is no longer a project of identification, but is the sharing of singularities around a certain kind of passion, he calls it. This becomes extremely suggestive, I think, for approaching the social form of the party. While the party is certainly at times a scene of membership, a closed circuit that tries to reinforce itself according to a set of internal meanings and rituals, it is also often constituted by its own undoing, whether by way of strangers who happen to enter, may be brought in by an invited guest, or by the fact of its rapturous nature. The party as being aligned with excess and even abjection, a breaking down and a leaking out. Within this scene of membership at times, we can also appreciate how things happen. Doors may be flung open, intruders may arrive, neighbors may slip in to complain. Friends may also suddenly become strangers. Lovers may betray. Bullies may enter the scene. So we can say that the party is always pushing against itself as a space of hospitality. Yes, friends suddenly break things, upset the order of the home, or turn against the host. Hospitality is fundamentally strained by the party. We could also say that this is the risk it must take. If it is to realize itself, the party must be dangerous and inhospitable. So we can hang on to those ideas to think about the sociality of the party. Even while tending towards inhospitality, I'm also interested to think in what way parties are expressive of a form of love. The co-mingling defining the party and the inoperative passion shaping its dynamics, unworking us, puts love into the crowd. I might call it a polyamorous scene whose criminal sensations and wild aggressions come to distribute love. shifting from the intimacies between two and toward a general social feeling. The party comes to act as a scene of loving each other, loving the party itself, a getting together that supports and nurtures friendships as what interrupts us, remakes us, even wrecks us. As such, the party may teach how to love more generally, to figure love not only as what may be shared through intimacy, but also as what one may bring into the crowd, to love for no reason. The community of passion that Nancy outlines is suggestive for such an understanding, where bonds are not necessarily traced by way of heritage, ancestry, investment, or history, but are found in the nocturnal splendor of the body as the violent joy that sustains us. The party, therefore, could be said to give expression to an impossible community, a community for and against itself, and may offer insight into the creative, erotic constitution of the common in general. Okay, so these are some thoughts about community. And now I just want to finish by a final third area to think about parties in relationship to knowledge. And we think the party as a knowledge practice. So here I want to think in what way the party is suggestive for a particular study. How does it relate itself to the field of knowledge? Is there a specific knowledge path or framework engendered by way of partying? And if so, what might its impact be on the general dynamics of research and education? Can there be such a thing as a scientific view or approach to the party as a cultural form? Questions of knowledge may equally be considered by way of notions of excess and the erotic, by what Georges Bataille calls sovereignty. And maybe some of you are also interested in Georges Bataille and some of his thinking around sovereignty. So for Bataille, sovereignty is found less through an act of possession, production, or labor, less as something that I hold or contain or strive for as a possession, as a struggle for self-determination. Rather, sovereignty, or what he terms the sovereign life, is articulated through forms of expenditure, a giving away, a form of excess, a surplus. Sovereignty exists beyond the necessities of life, beyond labor, beyond the acquisition of things, the holding that one often undertakes. Through such a view, rather, Bataille aims at recovering a sovereignty that all persons naturally possess, steering us by way of the pleasures of the sensual toward what he calls the miraculous. As he argues, sovereign life is grounded in the moment. It is a taking leave of the directive to produce, to be always operative in the service of a future to come. Instead, sovereign life is consciousness of the moment. And as such, it is never a work of knowledge. For to know is always to strive for truth, for use, for an end. For Bataille, rather, the miraculous instead resides in a state of unknowing, what he calls non-knowledge. It finds expression in also what he calls happy tears. So we can also talk about happy tears. The intensity of ecstatic being. Is not the party a scene of happy tears, where pain and pleasure, suffering and joy overlap, leading to all sorts of sudden, unknowing expressions of love, joy, also misery, pain, waking up with a hangover, that firmly situates one within the moment. The party turns the moment into a world of sensation, a common or rather uncommon life that requires an intensification of presence, maybe what we can think of as a deep hanging out, giving way to a form of what we want to think of as erotic knowledge, a knowledge of the moment and the sensuality of that moment, the intensity of ecstatic being. So here I want to think also in what way the party can be a form of pedagogy. So for example, how do we carry the party with us? If it teaches us, how do we then sort of carry it into other contexts in which we share with others and maybe also enact forms of pedagogy? So I've been thinking around this and found quite a useful pathway through the writings of Jan Mechelin, who writes about the notion of poor pedagogy. So he puts out the notion of a poor pedagogy, a model of poor pedagogy. And he contrasts to the notion of a rich methodology. A rich methodology is always shaped by the relaying of knowledge, the idea of passing down through a hierarchy of expertise. Yes, this sort of structure of pedagogy that teaches others, that in a way enacts a handing down of knowledge. In contrast, poor pedagogy grounds learning, what he calls impoverishing the tower of knowledge, in order to stay close to a process of collective discovery. Poor pedagogy locates us as a collective body gathered by way of curiosity, improvisation, and the joy of finding out together, where one must attend to what is found along the way, rather than what is stated or handed down. Poor pedagogy is about getting lost. It is about allowing for a lack of control. It is about risk-taking, vulnerability, and a lack of intention, what we can think of as a suspension of the plan, the curriculum, a putting on hold of one's expectations. And of course, this finds echo in Stefano Harney's and Fred Moten's understanding of study, which I'm sure might be of interest to you as well. Notion of study as a fugitive gesture, they call it, that explicitly counters the valorization of knowledge as a commodity. So for Harney and Moten, to study is to upset the classroom as what calls us into order. Study instead is posed as that which we do as a speculative practice, and which involves a range of activities, from cooking, cleaning, to walking and dancing, and certainly partying. To study, in short, is to draw out what they call intelligence in motion. In fact, for me, I would say to study might be to party with ideas, with each other, with things and materials, and with what we may create from nothing. So here I'm sort of thinking around then in what way parties educate us and also maybe provide us with a model of education. So I'm just going to finish by showing you some images. I hope it all works fine. I will try to play this. Okay, it says the Pirate Academy. I hope you see that. Okay, so as I was sort of doing this research, about party studies and sort of unpacking with my friends and colleagues these different reflections. I was also working at the Art Academy in Bergen in Norway as a professor. And we had just returned from lockdown. This was in the fall of 21, I believe. So we had spent a year, almost a year and a half, teaching online. And in September, when we returned, I really wanted to create something special to kind of reinvent my whole situation, or just kind of create something in which I could, yeah, encounter students and each other in a different way, and to really, in a way, celebrate that we were physically meeting again. So I launched the Pirate Academy, which really just was a very kind of loose poetic idea at first. And then it sort of blossomed and kept going for almost 2 years. So I really came back to the Academy and I thought, okay, we are alive. We made it. Let's celebrate that fact of being together. And so the Pirate Academy became basically a night school happening once a month. And it took place usually over 3 nights. So I thought of them as what I call research festivals. So they were parties. And they were parties and spaces of study and experimentation, ways of exploring our practices, reflecting on many ideas. So each Pirate Academy was also organized around a specific theme. So we did, for instance, a session on animism. One session was on the unfinished. Another session was on love. Another one was on common space. So they were presented that way as contexts of study. So we would unpack these themes through inviting guests to give presentations. It was always taking place in the main auditorium, which you see here, a kind of black box theater. So we had presentations, workshops, but also I can say there was always room for trying things out. So students would come and make small installations, maybe showing something they're working on, installing materials. And in a way, so it became a very horizontal situation. I was definitely not always in charge, or I was definitely not teaching, right? It was more about being together and letting things develop and emerge over those three evenings. And it kind of grew into such a beautiful, wonderful kind of project. And I think it was also something that provided a more undefined space for students in particularly, a very informal situation. One evening, a guest set up a radio transmission in the space and was broadcasting through the building with small radios, and kind of invited students and participants to talk about whatever was on their mind. And so it was very much about dialogical, participatory processes that I think quickly became definitely very festive. So I think the party was there without even needing to articulate it. Yeah. But I definitely felt that I was carrying a certain notion of party pedagogy into the space and into the approach of, in a way, making possible a certain kind of imagination that was very much about getting carried away. So it was always a lot of fun. There was a lot of good, positive energy in the room, a lot of generosity. Also, the sort of poor pedagogical proposal that Mashaline makes is also, you quite see the effects on ideas about who is responsible for what. Quickly, it became a feeling that we are all in this together. Therefore, I'm also responsible for holding that space, for attending to others, a kind of co-learning structure emerging. Some evenings, it was a bit like this, that was about listening and about changing the atmosphere of the space, testing out different perceptual experiences. Sometimes we even turned all the lights off and spoke in the dark. So it was very much also a kind of embodied process and sort of feeling present as a body. And things started to emerge. So then suddenly there was this portable kitchen that one of the PhD students built, and we would kind of place this outside of the auditorium in the foyer. So also the Pirate Academy started to leak out and sort of find itself into the building. There was a feeling of this party was also taking over. So we started, of course, cooking beforehand, gathering in the kitchen, hanging out together, kind of already starting with this kind of festive spirit. And it was always a moment of like thinking, okay, who is here? Who's showing up? A kind of coming together again. And I think that sense of temporality was really important, that it happened every month. And so it became a kind of a ritual that was really, I think, this feeling that we were journeying together. You know, we were kind of on this boat, this pirate ship going. And of course, drinking was very important. An element. I always provided free beer. Um, so I felt like I was like also Robin Hood, like redistributing the wealth from my professorial salary back to the students, giving them free beer, which they were very happy for, um, and allowing for things to just develop. So it was also exhausting, I can say. And sometimes, I mean, here, this is a beautiful evening you see in Bergen, but it's also, you know, it's around midnight right now. And so we always ran it between like 7 and 10 at night. But, you know, then suddenly we would, you know, students and everyone, we just kind of didn't want to end and the conversations would just continue. And I felt like I was, you know, there to kind of like, again, sort of just hold that context. And I had to kind of like just stay with it to the bitter end, which was often, you know, beautiful, but also this feeling of being tired. I think it also contributes somehow to this party pedagogy that we might think about together, to go to the bitter end, that wreckage that emerges. But then you have certain pieces that you pick up. So suddenly there was a moment where some students were like, well, we should really be archiving or documenting the Pirate Academy. And so they created a little archive you see here into one of the portable walls that they used for like gallery shows and things. So they cut open the wall and created an archive inside the wall. So it was definitely a kind of a pirate action of kind of hacking the system and putting up this hammock so you could kind of hang out and also rest, like a secret chamber that only the pirates knew about. And we started putting up posters and things from the different sessions. So it became a little library. And then, of course, it became, well, we had to maintain it. So everybody was in charge of maintaining it. And I have to say, it didn't last very long because, of course, you know, as pirates, we're kind of, you know, easily distracted. So, but then it also became very much about kind of a space for emotions and a space for personal stories. So one student presented a very personal paper about grief. She had been losing a lot of relatives and friends and going through a really hard time. And so, you know, just having that space for personal lives to come in and contribute to the space of education seemed really important and something that's often kind of overlooked or not given, not valued as a contribution, you know, to how we learn together. So these kind of, again, rituals, and then, you know, playing together as a group, always allowing for, you know, this playfulness, this improvisation to come forward. So I wanted to kind of just like share this as a sort of an expression maybe of how we can think the party in other contexts, how it might, you know, contribute to our practices in different ways. So I just maybe, yeah, come back to you. So I think I'll, yeah, conclude with that, and I'm more than happy to, yeah, talk about any of the issues or perspectives, or also to hear from you about how you're partying in your practice or otherwise. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Brandon. Wow, that was intense. a lot of parallel topics that we actually kind of get into during that 1 month and later with our, you know, online conversations. I have a couple of questions, but I'm happy to have first your questions if you have.
Seems like Fergus has a question.
Okay, yeah, sure.
Yeah, I'm not, well, first of all, thank you very much. That was fantastic. I'm not sure if this is going to form into a question or maybe just a point, but I'm interested in the idea of the site of the party, or the host site of the party. And when you were speaking, I kind of had in my head a domestic setting, but I'm also interested in how that the party can go beyond the domestic setting, and maybe how it overlaps with maybe like a club night, for example. And perhaps the reason that a domestic setting is interesting to imagine with the party is that there's a sort of sense of vulnerability, or something might get damaged, or the host is putting up their kind of delicate possessions, and there's a kind of delicacy around the home, and also a misuse of the home, perhaps, with using it for a party. And just maybe thinking about the role of like the vulnerability of the host or the host site or something like that. I'm not sure how you think about the role of the space in how the party functions.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that in. Yeah, I think some of the main perspectives that I was sharing was also, yeah, very informed by our first volume of party studies, which is on domestic spaces and the ways in which homes become sites of parties. So it was kind of touching in that direction. And part of that work really was also to think about, for example, we published a few contributions from individuals and communities from Budapest, who sort of who wrote about their experiences in the 1980s, during the kind of Soviet times, and how certain homes became places of gathering, because there was no other kind of open public possibilities for gathering collectively, particularly from the dissident opposition groups in Budapest at the time. So these apartments became political spaces as well. So the party was was a gesture of opposition, of resistance, of politics that in a way, you know, wasn't articulated as such, right? But it kind of just became that space for allowing for that community to kind of meet itself and to hang on together and to take pleasure against the odds, you know. And I kind of learned a lot through speaking with these artists, journalists, educators that we were in dialogue with. And it was really wonderful. They provided us with some beautiful photographs. One of them took of these party scenes, and just seeing, as you say, that vulnerability in those photos that was also so kind of touching in a way, and you know, speaking to them and really feeling that sense of vulnerability that was also a great sense of courage that was also present. And again, it wasn't necessarily about finding out about particular statements or like what was a sort of political position, but somehow just the party itself just sort of became a material manifestation of a certain kind of belief, you know, whether we want to call it in a belief in freedom or in democracy or in social justice or in just the possibilities of you know, a better future. So I just kind of was feeling that sense of vulnerability that you were speaking of, present in a lot of that material that I was discovering. And I didn't get a chance to really talk to them about the host and the specific spaces or apartments themselves. But now that you say that, that would be a nice conversation to have. I do know that there were like they talked about 2 or 3 apartments, and that became these kind of ongoing sites for gathering. So clearly there was someone hosting, and there was clearly some commitment made to providing that space. But as you say, there is definitely something to talk about there, about what are these spaces that are either formalized or informal that become sites for parties. And, you know, part of the discussions that we've had over the years was also looking into architectures of clubs, and of course, different versions of that, from kind of warehouses and industrial spaces to very posh, kind of elaborated, designed spaces for parties. So clearly, I think there can be a kind of spatial architectural analysis made, or a kind of concern for the spatial dimensions around partying. So yeah, I'd leave it at that, but thanks for bringing that in.
Amanda wants to ask a question, I guess.
Yeah, thank you. I'm very curious about, and hello again, and hello Vanu, hello everyone. I arrived a little bit later, but I wonder if the public space was considered, because in South America, the carnivals are a huge space for partying collectively and sonically. And I was wondering if you have any insights regarding the carnival as a space of collective and participatory, sonically speaking, participation. And maybe it's also connected with some of the previous theoretical kind of like thoughts that you made about the public space. But I think partying and as the carnival itself is such an important experience, because it's also cross different realms, not only the social aspect, but also the religious, the sacred, the canonical, in many ways, and especially in Bolivia, right? In Colombia, in Brazil. So I wonder if you have some insights about the carnival as a party space.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. Well, it's interesting because we were really hoping to, in our projected series of publications, the idea was to start from the home, move to the club, and then move to, as you suggest, these kind of large scale, open public parties, and the ways in which public space becomes redefined or captured or occupied for those kinds of expressions. So we haven't got there yet. So I might actually come back to you for a contribution for that volume, because I think, as you say, it's a really vital, interesting, important, exciting phenomenon and example to delve into. And of course, clearly, the notion of the carnival and the carnivalesque has been utilized in different kind of discursive and material and creative expressions and moments as a kind of input into how we can think or develop a certain imaginary, social imaginary that carnival provides us with. So I've been quite, taken with a lot of that, thinking, of course, that moment of the carnival as this rearrangement of social roles, the suspension of identities. At least I would say I'm sort of thinking around from a kind of traditions of medieval Europe forward, so not so much in the kind of Latin American context, but certainly in a kind of European context, the way that carnival functions that way, and still does on some level. Of course, it's also in Brazil. I mean, it's also extremely scripted and spectacularized. But I think you still find these kind of folk traditions very alive. For example, some years ago during carnival time in Germany, I traveled to a couple small villages in the Black Forest and attended these very low-key, localized folk expressions of carnival that were incredibly kind of moving and incredibly haunting as well, in which you see that the entire city, the entire village participates, and you also find out how, the carnival really defines those places in so many ways. So even prior to the carnival period, there's just a lot of preparation. There's a lot of planning, and how it carries over generations. So these traditions go back again, to the medieval period. And it's just amazing and maybe this echoes with some of the concerns you've been speaking about party as form, its relationship to kind of social community expressions or identities, how carnival really kind of shapes and allows for, maybe in that sense that Catherine Clement talks about an interruption that helps us also return to communities and to kind of social orders. The way that, of course, carnival is this radical interruption that is also so integrated into society. So it's not a kind of radical expression coming from out of nowhere, right? But it's sort of central. It's a kind of centerpiece of the kind of social order, which I find really fascinating, to think it that way, rather than to think about some sort of underground, expression from below. So these would be things, I think, to unpack and to sort of reflect upon, as you say, Amanda. Maybe others have something to say about carnival. Please feel free. Yeah.
Anyone about the carnival? I think I've never been in a carnival.
Not yet.
I mean, no, Carnaval de Kulturen, sorry, in Berlin, of course. I've been there so many times.
Yeah.
But that's very that's very has a problem. I have a question, like, as you mentioned, we have time, right, Christian? Can I ask? Or, right? We still have time. Yeah, cool. You mentioned like three kind of notions about partying. The first one, if I'm not mistaken, was the embodiment, and then community, and it comes studying. How, like, when you start to do this party studies, both the publication and also, you know, other projects that it comes around it, do you see part D or like that studies as a resistance of autonomy, and if is it like a potential to engage with political subversive notion, you know what I mean? Like, is it like creating like a political space for you, or like also the publication, not just the events, but at the same, or it's just for like just gathering around these notions that you were mentioning?
Yeah. Oh, let's see. You hear me? Yeah. Thank you, Banu. I think maybe what I really what the party helps me realize or hang on to is a relationship to the unnamed. Yeah. So when we start saying the party is political, is the party about that? Is it an articulation of a certain intention? We could say that it is, and at the same time, it's also not. Or it kind of also provides us with a space of the unnameable. And this is maybe, you know, a proposition, right? A kind of ideal party. But nonetheless, I find at least personal experiences that sort of point me in that direction. And I think this is what I find the party as almost a usefulness in keeping us close to a certain kind of liminal space, right? A certain kind of liminality in which we don't really know where the party is taking us. What is this party? So for instance, again, I was recently in Madrid for a launch of the Party Studies book, and we had it at a very large established squat in the city in which they were having a party. And so they were having a party, and then suddenly we stopped and we introduced the book and we had a little discussion about parties. And there was a few voices who started to, in a way, challenge us. And they sort of like challenged us in different ways. Because for that squat community, at least on some level, the party was definitely a political statement. It was definitely about building communities of resistance, all of which I completely support and agree with and understand and participate in. And at the same time, I really wanted to like invite this other imagination that, yes, here we are partying, and you and you and you and you may think it's about this, but there's somehow within that, there's always this element of agitation, that inhospitality, the kind of deterritorializing potential of what emerges in the party has to be that thing that leads us to the unnameable, or that undoes what we think we know what we're doing, you know, that subverts even the subversive. And so I find, you know, this for me is something to learn from, you know, and something to try to think about and to reflect upon and to follow a little bit. So maybe it's something about the unconscious, can be an element, you know, maybe even going back to carnival, how the carnival is clearly about, even if it's formalized and scripted, it's about giving way to an unconscious background of society, allowing for the animal, allowing for the beast, the wild, to have a place, the suspension of identity. So somehow or another, I want to hang on to the party in a kind of radical sense that really, again, I can't control it. I can't tell you what it is. I can't know what it will be. Yeah. And maybe that's again what it teaches us. Yeah. What it how not to know, or how to know otherwise, how to be interrupted. Yeah, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes very much sense. Like it's very in a very easy way to say, like the best parties is like the ones that you never plan, no? Like it's when you plan so much that it's just like creates a disappointment, I guess. So yeah, anyone else want to add something, questions? Yeah, Kelly. Kelly.
Hi. Hey, Brandon, thank you so much for your talk. I really appreciated it. And I really appreciated, you can hear me, yeah?
Yep.
Yeah. I really appreciated you. I mean, as you just spoke about, right? Like the destabilizing elements of parties and like what an important learning tool they are. And also just some of the, being like messed up, going too far, wrecked, staggering, revolts, inhospitality. And I'm currently in this place where I work, this university where I work with my lovely friend and coworker here. And it's, sorry, this question is forming, but it's like about, I think the limits of party specifically within an educational structure. I feel like I've been a part of a number of conversations lately about like retention with the student numbers, and then also what it means to kind of host students and have to project a kind of stabilizing force, so to be like, you can be here and learn and, but in order to do that or feel comfortable doing that, I need to project a kind of like maybe a performance of stability. And then I'm also thinking about this in terms of like in the UK for the past several years, and I only really got very slightly involved last year with the University College Union protests and marking boycott. And then recently I've, encountered just a bit more information around like the fees movement in South Africa. And just like, obviously there are like huge stakes and, there are livelihoods at stake to letting things fall in specifically like a educational institution. But then at the same time, like holding on to the importance of this kind of unraveling, not only to the health of the educational institution itself, but also to like the student's ability to learn. And also like, what is an art education, like, so I guess I've been thinking about that, especially in terms of like, as an educator, like how much can I advocate for a kind of, wreckage and unraveling, and where can I put it so that so I don't get fired, but then, and I also like don't completely like wreck my students' lives, but also, yeah, right, like it results in a learning opportunity and maybe an educational institution that has a bit more room in it.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Kelly. Yeah. No, I can appreciate your concern, your questioning. Like I think maybe going back to my experiences also in Bergen running the Pirate Academy, like it was also clear that while it was a very open situation and there was many different students floating through over the year, and still there was like a community building around it. It also clearly, in a way, wasn't for everyone, right? There was also students who didn't come, who didn't feel it was something for them or just didn't feel drawn to it. And that was okay, of course, I mean, it was just So I can also see how that was my party, right? Very much shaped by who I am and what I felt was important, and my sensibility, all of that. And there was probably other parties going on that I didn't know about, that I wouldn't go to even. I can definitely imagine. And so I think, yeah, like maybe as you say, like all the things I'm talking about, they may also not be what others would do, right? Or how others would speak about the party, or would find parties meaningful in totally different ways. So just to sort of highlight that. And yeah, your question, maybe in a way, I think what I felt also in Bergen was it was a moment where, if anybody has been there to the new academy that opened around 2015 or later, it was a new building that was built, very structured, very contemporary, highly designed space, that was quite different than the previous buildings that the academy had been in, which were very messy and old and simple and kind of like appropriated buildings. And I think what happened was that I definitely felt that the culture at the academy, changed because of that building, right? And it went along with becoming part of the university, with becoming suddenly, having a doctoral program. So becoming a certain kind of academicization, another form of institution, which was, totally fine. But I did feel that maybe it needed also another kind of dynamic at times, something that was much more disordered, much more informal, much more loose, much more driven by students, horizontal, all those things that I highlighted. So I think it became like meaningful in that way to give a certain flexibility into the routine, into the pattern, to show another type of form. Yeah. So that's why I also felt the pirate was also quite an appropriate term, because it sort of hijacked the institution and just kind of parasitically opened up another dimension that I think in a way also contributed to the order, right? It's sort of like it was the nighttime experience that then fed into the daytime and became more holistic. Yeah. So I think it contributed in that way to the stability of things, while, allowing for maybe, as Amanda says, this carnivalesque moment of nocturnal identities and sort of a playfulness that you couldn't find during the day. And so, I mean, just to share that, and also to say again that even within the Pirate Academy sessions, there was a great deal of sensitivity, a great deal of tenderness, a great deal of care that I think became really an important element that helped, as you say, maybe find a certain kind of stability to what students are experiencing, normally, and how they kind of try to perform as students and even are called upon to be exceptional at such an early age, all those pressures. And so I think that Pirate Academy also became another space for taking care of the body and hanging out together, cooking, talking about personal things. So it was also very tender. So maybe, yeah, these are also qualities that I kind of learned about and definitely feel that I kind of carry with me as I move through different institutions. So I can appreciate your concern to try to, work within existing structures and negotiate all of those tensions and challenges. Yeah, thank you.
Anyone else? Anything to add?
Maybe I can just chip in a tiny bit onto that question, which was that was interesting, Kelly, that you were thinking about the party as fitting into like quite a formal like structure, for example, university. So I got really excited when Brandon was talking about it, is the idea of the pedagogical possibilities of the party, but just within the party and not being like attached to another structure or anything. Just the possibilities within each individual party as maybe even like a site for teaching and learning or learning together or something like that. So I find that really exciting, like imagining it not attached to a pre-existing kind of educational structure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I have also something to add. I also find it like very, very exciting in that like informal way of including partying in a different setting, and I think coming from like underground club scene, and I remembering even in Berlin in the most of the BIPOC parties like initiating awareness teams. No, that's one of the things. Like what happened to me, like it's a skill sharing thing, like awareness is not that you can get an education, but you skill share your experience, and then you can become like the awareness team in different parties. The thing is, like what happened last time is like I've been in a conference that there been a protest, a Palestinian protest in Berlin. It has been stopped by an awareness team, or they kind of had the name of awareness team, but it wasn't an awareness team. It wasn't a very leftist concept, but that was definitely not a democratical position there, like stopping the protesters and so on. So I questioned this, like, are we, like when we do this informal, like when we apply everything that we know or we create in informal settings, there's always someone to learn from us and kind of counter us. That institution made everything possible. Kind of like they brought the awareness team, they did everything correct, but then it was kind of against the same group that it's initiated. You know what I mean? It's so I challenged a lot, so because that comes from like a clubbing scene or clubbing situation. But of course, in that club, there's a bunch of other people. You cannot really select because partying is exactly that, how we said like before to me, like that's unknown. So yeah, I just wanted to share it. It's not a comment, like it's not a question. It's just like to keep it in mind.
Yeah, no, I think that's interesting, Banu. Yeah, to kind of like remind us again of that tensions that are held within parties, social tensions, relational tensions, so many different dynamics that again, can be taken over, can be instrumentalized, can be hijacked, can be directed in moments by the dominance of certain groups or against others, for example. So there is this, I think, embedded violence and aggressiveness in the party that is also what it's also part of its beauty, so again, we can't really quite position it in a stable way, right? Somehow we have to also embrace that
Yeah.
possibility. Yeah.
The best party is the unplanned one. Yeah. Yeah. Right, Christian.
Yes, but we only have a few minutes left. I just wanted to say thank you as well. It's a very interesting talk, and it also got me thinking about another Georges Bataille term, which is the formless or inform. So which is, yeah, basically like an anti-definition. So everything that you cannot name should remain formless, which makes parties form, you know, yes, contradictory, or whatever you want to call it. As I remember, he says something about, you know, when you define it, it's like putting a frock coat over a formless substance. In the end, you're only describing the frock coat. So I think that was interesting. I also have some other questions about transgression as learning compared to, you know, the pressure valve theory that you just sort of in the European context, that because I think in some cultures you use parties as or see them as pedagogical, or as, you know, learning exercises in a way. Sort of transgressing your own subjectivity is valuable, whereas in the Western context, which is the only one I can really talk about, it's not seen as something valuable from a learning perspective. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, and if it was a clear question. I'm not sure it was.
Yeah, no, thanks for bringing those in. I mean, also if somebody else wants to say something, please feel free. But yes, I think this. I was also wondering a little bit about that performativity, in a sense that maybe you're suggesting, Christian, which is like the trying on of things. So when we go to parties, maybe we dress up, right? We try on things. We try on not only clothes or costumes, but identities, languages. And maybe that's also part of the creative potentiality of transgressing as a kind of learning experience, but it's also the party maybe can also create a safe space for trying on things, you know, like rehearsing oneself in a new way. Being that vulnerability, maybe going back to, is also you know, a vulnerability that allows us to, you know, to experience something else, right? To be open to finding oneself in a new way, discovering new loves and new communities. So I think that idea of transgression is also exciting to hang on to, in that sense, that it doesn't need to always be a total radical upheaval of things, but it's a playfulness. It's a trying things on, having fun, right? That sense of pleasure and joy that parties can allow for in ways that we don't get it in any other context. That again, I think can be quite also soft. Yeah, it can be soft, and again, how we learn from that and carry that with us back into the day, I think is a really vital experience. You know.